Imagine waking up one morning and watching the sun disappear. Not slowly, not gently, but swallowed whole. A wall of dirt, black as midnight and taller than a skyscraper, rolling across the horizon like the end of the world itself. You can't run from it, you can't hide from it. You stand on your porch on the land your grandfather broke his back to own and you watch it come. And when it hits, you can't see your hand in front of your face. You breathe in grit, your teeth crack on dust. The children are screaming inside the house, and the chickens are dead in the yard, and the wheat, what little was left of the wheat, is gone. Just gone. Buried. Gone the way everything goes when the sky itself turns against you. This is the story of the Dust Bowl, one of the most devastating environmental and human catastrophes in American history. A decade-long nightmare that turned the richest farmland on Earth into a wasteland, drove hundreds of thousands of families from their homes, and forced an entire nation to confront a terrifying truth: that the land could be broken, that the Earth itself could fight back. And that no amount of ambition, no amount of American optimism, could outrun the consequences of what had been done to it. This is not just a story about weather. It is a story about hubris and desperation, about the collision between human greed and natural law, about what happens when millions of people are stripped of everything: their land, their livelihood, their dignity, and left to wander across a country that doesn't quite know what to do with them. It is a story that feels, with unsettling clarity, like it was written for our time. Let's go back to the beginning. The Great Plains of North America stretch across the middle of the continent like a vast, golden sea. Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Colorado, Nebraska, the Panhandle, the High Plains. For thousands of years, this land was home to enormous herds of bison, 60 million of them at their peak, and to the indigenous peoples who had lived alongside and hunted those herds for generations. The Comanche, the Kiowa, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho. These were peoples who understood the land, who moved with it, who did not try to make it do something it was not built to do. The native grasses of the Great Plains, blue grama, buffalo grass, bluestem, had evolved over millennia to hold this landscape together. Their roots went down deep, sometimes 6 feet into the earth. They had survived drought before. They had survived wind before. They were the web that held the world above them in place. Then the bison were slaughtered, systematically, deliberately, catastrophically. By the 1880s, a population of 60 million had been reduced to a few hundred animals. The indigenous people who depended on them were pushed onto reservations, and the land, the vast, open, ancient land, was suddenly empty, or at least that was the story the American government and railroad companies told. It was empty, it was waiting, it was free. Homesteaders came. They came by the tens of thousands. They came with wooden plows and iron ambition and the deep, sincere belief that if you worked hard enough on American soil, that soil would reward you. The Homestead Act of 1862 had promised 160 acres to anyone willing to farm it. And so they came, from the cities of the East and from the farms of Europe, from Germany and from Ireland and from Scandinavia, all of them drawn by the promise of land, their own land. Land that would make them free. They broke the sod. That is the term, broke the sod. And there is something in that phrase, something almost ominous in retrospect, because that is exactly what they were doing, breaking something. The thick, matted, ancient root system that had held the plains together for thousands of years was torn up, turned over, and replaced with row after row of wheat. The farmers called themselves sodbusters, and they wore the name proudly. They were tamming the wilderness. They were making the desert bloom. They were being American. For a while it worked. The rains came. The wheat grew. The prices were good. During World War I, the demand for wheat skyrocketed. Europe needed feeding, and the American plains were happy to oblige. Farmers plowed more and more land. They bought tractors on credit. They pushed deeper into the marginal lands, the drier lands, the lands that the old-timers quietly said should probably be left alone. But the prices were good. The rains kept coming. And nobody wanted to hear warnings when prosperity was on the table. Then the rain stopped. The drought that descended on the Great Plains in the early 1930s was not unprecedented in geological terms. The region had experienced severe droughts before, many times over thousands of years. But those previous droughts had struck a landscape covered in deep-rooted native grass. A landscape that, while it might brown and thin, would hold together. This drought struck a landscape that had been stripped naked. 100 million acres of native sod plowed under in the space of a single generation. And without the grass, without the roots, without any anchor at all, the soil just waited for the wind. The wind was always there on the plains. Anyone who had ever lived there knew the wind. It was constant, relentless, a character in daily life. But now when the wind came, it found nothing to hold the topsoil down. It picked up the fine, dry, pulverized dirt that had been turned over and over by machinery, ground down to a consistency almost like talcum powder, and it carried it. miles, hundreds of miles, thousands of feet into the air. The first of what would come to be called black blizzards struck on November 11, 1933 in South Dakota. Witnesses described a wall of earth, dark brown and black, moving across the prairie. It wasn't fog, it wasn't smoke, it was the earth itself moving. The storm turned day into night, it buried fences, it filled in ditches. It piled drifts of dirt against the sides of farmhouses the way snow drifts in a blizzard, except there was no melting this. When it was over, the land looked like a moonscape. More storms followed. Throughout 1934 and 1935 and 1936, the black blizzards came with terrifying regularity. The worst of them, Black Sunday, April 14, 1935, is one of the most documented days of meteorological horror in American history. The day had actually started beautifully. The sky was clear, the air was warm. People who had been living through months of misery came out of their houses, took walks, breathed something other than dust for the first time in what felt like forever. And then in the afternoon they looked north. And there it was, a wall of black, not brown, black, rolling and churning and massive, 2 miles high, blotting out the sky from horizon to horizon. By the time it hit the town of Boise City, Oklahoma, it was so dark that people literally could not see their hands. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in minutes. Cars and tractors stalled from dirt clogging their engines. Children who were caught outside were found curled up in ditches, holding their coats over their faces, trying to breathe. The storms reached far beyond the plains. Dust from Oklahoma and Texas drifted over Chicago, turning the sky a peculiar orange-brown. It drifted over Washington, D.C., where members of Congress were debating agricultural policy. It drifted over New York City, coating the window ledges of skyscrapers with Great Plains topsoil. Ships in the Atlantic, 300 miles from the coast, reported a haze of dust settling on their decks. The heartland of America was literally dissolving and blowing away, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. But the weather, as catastrophic as it was only one part of the catastrophe, because into this nightmare of failing land and falling prices and blinding storms came the Great Depression. The stock market crash of 1929 had already begun destroying the American economy before the dust storms arrived. Banks were failing. Unemployment was climbing toward 25%. Prices for farm goods, already dropping before the drought, collapsed entirely. A bushel of wheat that had sold for $1 in the good years was fetching 25 cents. The farmers were not just losing their crops to the dust, they were losing their land to the banks. The combination drought, dust, depression created something new, a crisis of displacement on a scale the United States had never seen before. By the mid-1930s, hundreds of thousands of families across Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Colorado, and the surrounding states were simply leaving. They loaded what they had left into their cars, their trucks, their wagons. They strapped mattresses to the roofs. They tied children to the running boards. They said goodbye to the land, to the graves of their parents and grandparents, to the churches where they had been baptized and married, to the communities that had been the entire world to them, and they drove west. They became known, most of them, as Okies, a name that was not given with kindness. The term was used dismissively, contemptuously, a label that carried the full weight of American class anxiety and regional prejudice. These were poor people, desperate people, people who had lost everything and were arriving in California with almost nothing, looking for work, looking for something, looking for any foothold on the ladder of survival. There were hundreds of thousands of them. Some estimates suggest that between 1930 and 1940, more than 3.5 million people left the Great Plains, the largest internal migration in American history to that point. The road to California, Route 66, the Mother Road, became the artery of their exodus. Families crammed into overloaded Model A Fords, burning oil and clattering through the desert. Cars broke down in the Mojave. People ran out of money in New Mexico. Children died of heat and malnutrition in the back seats of cars pulled off to the side of the road. And when the survivors finally crossed the border into California, the promised land, what they found was not welcome. California was already struggling with its own Depression-era poverty. The growers needed cheap labor, yes, but they needed it on their terms, desperate labor. Labor that would accept whatever wage was offered and never complain, because to complain was to be replaced by someone even more desperate who was right behind you in the line. Labor camps appeared across the San Joaquin Valley, places of almost unimaginable squalor, tar paper shacks, no running water, no sanitation. Wages that could not feed a family even if every member worked sunup to sundown. And surrounding all of this, the rich agricultural abundance of California, oranges rotting on the trees, cotton fields white and waiting, while the people who could pick it were hungry. The hostility went beyond poor wages. California established border checkpoints, actual checkpoints, on American highways, stopping American citizens to try to keep the migrants out. Local police forces in California towns conducted what they called bum blockades, turning back anyone who looked too poor, too dusty, too desperate. In one documented episode in 1936, the Los Angeles Police Department sent 125 officers to the Arizona and Oregon state borders with orders to turn back any undesirables, an operation that was constitutionally dubious to say the least, and which was eventually ended under pressure, but which spoke volumes about the reception these migrants could expect. Families were split, marriages broke under the pressure. Men who had owned their own land, who had defined their entire identity around being landowners, around the independence and dignity that came with that, found themselves picking someone else's crops for pennies, sleeping in ditches, feeding their children on whatever could be scraped together. The psychological devastation was enormous and largely unacknowledged. There was no language for trauma in 1930s America, no framework for processing what these people were going through. You were supposed to be tough. You were supposed to endure. You were not supposed to talk about the weight of what had been lost. And yet the humanity of these people insisted on being seen. Because among the migrants and among those who witnessed the crisis there were artists, writers and photographers who understood that history was happening, that something important and terrible was unfolding, and that it needed to be documented. Dorothea Lange was a photographer working for the Farm Security Administration when she stopped her car on a highway in Nipomo, California, in February of 1936 and walked toward a migrant camp. There in the camp she found a 32-year-old woman sitting with her children. The woman's name was Florence Owens Thompson, though Lange did not learn her name that day. Lange took 6 photographs. The most famous of them, the image that became known as Migrant Mother, is perhaps the most recognized photograph of the 20th century. A woman's face creased with exhaustion and worry, her eyes somewhere in the middle distance, 2 of her children turned away and buried against her shoulders. It is an image of dignity in extremity, of humanity refusing to be erased even when everything around it is being destroyed. John Steinbeck spent years in the migrant camps of California, interviewing families, living alongside them, understanding their world. In 1939 he published The Grapes of Wrath, the story of the Joad family, Oklahoma sharecroppers driven from their land by the Dust Bowl, making their way west on Route 66, arriving in California to find exploitation and contempt rather than opportunity. The novel was an immediate, shattering phenomenon. It sold 500,000 copies in the first year. It made people in comfortable circumstances confront what was happening to their fellow Americans. It made people angry. It made people cry. It was banned in libraries and burned in some places, and it won the Pulitzer Prize, and it went on to become one of the foundational texts of American literature, a book that has never gone out of print, that has never stopped being read, that has never stopped being relevant. The Grapes of Wrath was relevant because Steinbeck understood something that the politicians and the economists were slower to grasp, that the Dust Bowl was not simply bad luck. It was not just a drought. It was the result of choices, human choices, agricultural policies that had incentivized the plowing of marginal land, economic systems that had left farmers no option but to push harder and plant more, even when the land was telling them to stop. A culture that had treated the natural world as an inexhaustible resource to be exploited rather than a living system to be respected. The sky had not turned black by accident. The sky had turned black because of what had been done to the land below it. That understanding, slow, imperfect, contested, did begin to work its way into government policy. Franklin Roosevelt's administration, already transforming the role of the federal government through the New Deal, grasped that the Dust Bowl required a response that was ecological as well as economic. Hugh Hammond Bennett, a soil scientist who had been warning about the dangers of soil erosion for years, had been ignored for most of his career. Now in the early 1930s, he was suddenly the most important man in American agriculture. Bennett essentially created the field of soil conservation as a government priority. He testified before Congress on the dangers of topsoil loss, and according to the story told by those who were there, he timed his testimony so that it coincided with a massive dust storm that was drifting over Washington at that very moment. The congressmen looked out the windows of the Capitol at the haze settling on the city, and they voted for Bennett's Soil Conservation Act almost unanimously. The Civilian Conservation Corps planted more than 200 million trees across the Great Plains, a shelter belt of windbreaks designed to slow the wind and hold the soil. Farmers were paid to try new techniques, contour plowing, crop rotation, leaving stubble on the ground rather than turning everything under. The Taylor Grazing Act regulated the use of public lands in ways that had not been regulated before. These were not perfect solutions, and the transformation was slow, and the drought did not end quickly. The really serious dust storms continued until the late 1930s, with some areas not seeing significant rainfall until 1941. But gradually the land began to recover, not fully. Not everywhere. Some areas lost so much topsoil during the Dust Bowl years that they have never fully recovered. But enough recovery happened that the worst of the crisis was survivable. World War II changed everything again as it changed everything everywhere. The war created demand for agricultural products on a massive scale. The rains returned to the plains. The wheat grew again, the economy recovered enough that people could find work, build lives, begin the long and painful process of rebuilding. The migrants in California, the Okies, the Arkies, the people who had been so despised when they arrived, became an integral part of the California working class, their labor woven into the foundations of the state's agricultural economy. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren are Californians now, and many of them carry family stories of the highway and the camps and the dust that are as much a part of American identity as any other founding myth. But the Dust Bowl did not go away as a lesson, or it should not have, because the conditions that created it, the combination of industrial agriculture, short-term economic incentives, climate pressure, and a failure to understand the limits of natural systems did not go away. They evolved, they intensified. In the 1970s, another boom in agricultural prices drove another wave of plowing in the Plains states, and soil scientists watched with anxiety as farmers turned over grassland that the New Deal generation had worked to protect. Irrigation from the Ogallala Aquifer, a vast underground reservoir that underlies much of the Great Plains, expanded enormously in the second half of the 20th century, allowing agriculture to continue even in dry years. But the Ogallala is not replenished by rainfall at any rate close to the rate at which it is being drawn down. It is, in essence, being mined. And when it is gone, the Great Plains face a reckoning that will make the 1930s look manageable. Climate change makes all of this worse. The Great Plains are already one of the regions of the United States most affected by increasing temperatures and changing precipitation patterns. The droughts that are projected for the mid to late 21st century under current emissions trajectories are expected to be more severe than anything recorded in the historical era. Some climate scientists have begun using the term a permanent dust bowl to describe what portions of the American heartland may face in the coming decades. This is not apocalyptic exaggeration. It is the considered assessment of people who have studied the region's climate history in careful detail. And so the story of the 1930s becomes not just history. It becomes prophecy. It becomes a mirror held up to the present moment and the choices being made right now about how to treat the land, how to regulate agriculture, how to balance short-term economic pressure against long-term ecological reality. The families who loaded their Fords on Route 66 were not statistics. They were people. They were people who had done what their culture told them to do: work hard, own land, feed the world, and who had been destroyed by a combination of natural disaster and human failure that neither they nor their leaders fully understood until it was too late. That is the thing about the Dust Bowl that never quite lets go. It is the human scale of it. The specific, personal, devastating human scale. A mother covering her children's faces with wet rags so they can breathe during a dust storm. A man standing at the edge of his field watching the last of his topsoil lift away into the sky, knowing that 20 years of work are disappearing on the wind, and that there is absolutely nothing he can do. A family of 6 sleeping in a car in the California desert because they have nowhere else to go and 60 cents to their name. A little girl coughing up brown mud into a handkerchief and developing what the doctors call dust pneumonia, a disease that didn't even have a name before the 1930s, a disease born entirely out of the disaster humans had made. These were not people who had failed. They were people who had been failed by systems larger than themselves, by policies they had not made, by cultural narrative that had told them the land was theirs to use as they saw fit without any reckoning to follow. And when the reckoning came, they bore it in their bodies and their children's bodies and their families and their futures. The price of the choices that had created the Dust Bowl was paid by people who had the least power to change those choices. That is the part of the story that history books sometimes skip past, and it is the part that matters most. The sky turned black over America. It turned black because of what had been done to the earth beneath it, because of overconfidence and exploitation and the refusal to hear warnings that were given clearly and repeatedly by the land itself. It turned black and stayed black for years, and by the time the sky cleared again, hundreds of thousands of lives had been shattered beyond repair. We know how this story ends. We know the rains came back. We know the trees grew. We know the migrants built new lives, that the plains recovered enough to farm again, that the nation survived and moved on. But survival is not the same as wisdom. Recovery is not the same as understanding. And the land is still there, still vulnerable, still capable of turning on us if we forget again what it needs. Still capable, under the right or the wrong conditions, of teaching us again in the hardest possible way what happens when you break something ancient and irreplaceable in the name of short-term profit. When the sky turns black again and somewhere someday under some combination of heat and drought and stripped earth, the question will be the same as it was in 1935. Not just what happened, but who bore the cost, and whether this time finally we were paying attention.